Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a conductor who's at the very beginning of her career. She's appeared as a finalist in competitions as both a conductor and a violinist, and taken part in masterclasses with some of the world's greatest conductors. During the pandemic, she conducted a high-profile jump-in concert with the London Symphony Orchestra, and she's just started as the assistant conductor at the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra in the United States. It's a pleasure to welcome Stephanie Childress. Stephanie, lovely to meet you, to see you. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's a real pleasure. I'm going to go right back, even though I know you're a violinist, because I've seen you on the telly, playing in the BBC Young Musician of the Year, which we'll come to later. But was the violin the first thing you played? And do you come from a musical household?
The violin actually wasn't the first thing I started on. It was the first thing that inspired me to get into classical music. But I actually started with the piano, and unfortunately didn't pursue it very seriously, which is something that I, as all conductors know, piano skills are quite important. So I'm trying to get back to it. But no, I don't come from a musical family. In a way, they are sort of beautifully amusical, if one could say that. They enjoy a lot of sort of pop music. My mum was sort of an old rocker, and my dad was around, when the Beach Boys were big in the States and stuff. So that's kind of their level of musical sort of knowledge. So I wouldn't say a typical classical music family at all.
Much like mine. I mean, I've said it before. It was Johnny Mathis and Cliff Richard in our house. Not much classical music at all. I think in some ways it keeps you grounded a little bit. Now, you can go back home and it's not all music.
Absolutely. For us, it was mostly you mentioned those two. For us, it was Tina Turner and Queen. So that gives you a spectre of things we were listening to.
And so if you started on the piano, when did the violin happen for you?
It happened a couple of months later. It was a kind of a deal between my mum and I, sort of 5-year-old me and my mum. She said, if you want to learn the violin, why don't we just start off with the piano and see how we get along? And I think it was quite a sensible thing to do. I really enjoyed getting to grips with, theory and, some very basic musical knowledge through having the keys in front of me. I think that's always very good for a young child if you can sort of visualize the music that you're making. Obviously with the violin, it's much more kinetic. So I really enjoyed that. I'm really glad we did that, and I should have stuck to it.
Well, at least you did start on the piano. I didn't start on the piano at all. I went straight for the violin, and so everything was sort of done through the fingers of the left hand. Learning about keys and learning about it was all done through scales and arpeggios. And yeah, I wished I'd had a keyboard background. I don't. Doesn't mean I can't, sit down at the piano and work out an orchestral score, but I can't play it. I can work it out, but I can't play it. First of all, I don't know which part of the UK you're from, which might mean that you may or may not early on have encountered some sort of county music system or city music system. When did that happen, if it happened, and did that mean playing in ensembles at all?
Funnily enough, it didn't happen at all. So I was born in London, but spent a couple of years in the south of France, where there was kind of, in the rural local school. So there was really no music at all. And then I went to, when we eventually moved back to London, I went to the French lycée. And I think the French musical system, my understanding of it, is that, if you're good at something, you go to a specialized school, whether you're a sports person or a music person, that's kind of what you do. So I didn't have a huge amount of music at my school, but in a way that gave me the opportunity to really look for other things outside of music. I think this is something that I still try and sort of hold. I still try and hold true to this idea that we're so much more than musicians. We're people as well, and in order to feed our music making, we have to go out and experience the world, etc. So the French school was great in that sense, because there was hardly any music. And for anyone who knows the French system, I mean, I went to the school in South Kensington, and we had, by the end of my time there, we had 4,500 kids. So it's not really personalized tuition in the sense that I understand a lot of hard the English system can be. But thankfully, eventually I enrolled in the junior department at the Royal College of Music. And that was kind of, not only my first, my first experience of collective music making, it was also my first experience of English kids. I didn't have a lot of English school friends who were all French. So that was, a culture shock in every sense of the word, but hugely enjoyable.
By now, at this point, you've now just said it's your first time collective music making. So that's chamber music, quartets, trios, but also I would imagine there was a junior RCM orchestra. Did conducting at all enter your consciousness, being a conductor or thinking about conducting at this young age, or was that something much later on?
I think it's much later on because I was 13 when the conducting light bulb sort of clicked. But to be honest, for a long time, all throughout my childhood, the last thing I wanted to do was actually become a musician. It was a very serious hobby, but I had other hobbies. I did a lot of sports for a long time, and I did ice skating quite seriously, and swimming and stuff. So it was kind of always around, but I really thought that was the last thing I'd be doing. I think particularly because the violin for me was I always had a very difficult relationship with the instrument. It's something that I didn't take very naturally to. It took me a while also to find the right teacher for me. My mum sort of still reminisces about how I had 9 violin teachers within the space of about 10 years. Just because it was very, very difficult to find someone with whom I connected. So it was a difficult relationship. I think that's why the idea of even becoming a musician never really popped into my head. But as I said, sort of when I was about 13, 14, that sort of light bulb switched on in my head. And not only did I realize that I wanted to be a musician, but I wanted to be a conductor, which was something I'd never really thought about before. So it was all very sudden. Beautiful as it was, very sudden, very unexpected, but yeah, delighted it happened.
I'm going to go to competitions because, as I said, I'd seen you on the telly, as we say in the UK, and because you'd reached the final, or you were a finalist in the BBC Young Musician of the Year twice, 2016 and 2018.
The string
final, yes, category final, yes.
Yeah, the string final. I don't want to. Yeah, there are plenty of people who made it much further who deserve to be mentioned properly.
My fault.
It's the strings final.
Yeah, my fault for not being totally specific. But I mean, later on, you then also came second in the Maestra competition in 2020, which we'll come to when we go back to conducting. But it does mean that you were obviously very, very talented violinist, and you were going for competitions. How much conducting were you doing through this point of your time, or was everything really focused on that violin world? And because I know what it's like, I remember I used to be a violinist too. How much focus was there really on competitions like that, recitals, all of that stuff that we did or do as violinists?
Yeah, it can be pretty all-consuming, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was interesting because I did my first young musician when I was in my first year at university, and I did my second one when I was in my last year at university. And I mean, it was something that just came around because I'd always wanted to participate in a competition. It's not something that I looked for particularly. But it's funny that you mentioned, you just asked me how much conducting I was doing at the same time. And I remember, I was doing a lot.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I chose to go to university and not, music college, because I just wanted a bit more flexibility in terms of the projects that I wanted to take on, the projects that I created. We had some great singers, so we did lots of operas, Beethoven 9 in my final year as well. So, I was doing quite a lot of conducting, and I think it was interesting trying to kind of slot BBC Young Musician in between my Rape of Lucretia rehearsals, and my Beethoven 9 rehearsals and stuff. But I just thought I applied, and when I got in, I just thought, why not go for it? It would be crazy not to. And it's not as though I have a dislike for the violin. I mean, the violin is my, kind of like my first love. It gave me so much, and it's something that I even now I still refer to. If I'm doing bowings, or if I even want to sort of experiment with the type of string sound that I then want to hear in a string section, it's something that I find extremely useful. So I wouldn't, I would never have just written it off, just as soon as I decided to become a conductor. I think especially being in youth orchestras like the NYO were huge parts of my learning and of my development, even as a conductor, even before I was really conducting. I mean, the amount of conductors that we saw that sort of went around was hugely informative. And I think as a young person, you learn so much more from watching conductors in a way than often from doing. I mean, obviously you then have to start getting a lot of practical experience, but as an initial step, I think that was hugely very helpful.
So where did you go to university? And whilst you were there, were you being taught conducting? Did you have a conducting teacher or a mentor or somebody you could speak to whilst you were doing your projects at university?
So not really. So I went to the University of Cambridge, and I went there because, as I said, I just wanted a bit of a broader education than what I thought music college could have offered me. I think particularly because I dropped out of school when I was 15, I just thought, I really want a kind of complete education. I want somewhere that's going to make me write essays and dissertations and make me do analysis, because that's just not what I've had, in my primary and in my secondary school. I mean, the French system is very different. And I thought, if I want to be working in Britain, I want to sort of get that sort of UK university experience as well. And so that's sort of why I did it. It's a tricky one, because you don't actually get any practical tuition really at Cambridge. I think about 5% of my module included practical performance, but that was an elective. And so we didn't get a lot of, so basically, no hand, you just have to do your thing on the side and make sure that you hand in your essays on time, or not, as I recall, which was my experience. But I think it was the right thing for me. Also, just being around people who did a whole host of different subjects was absolutely fantastic. I mean, some of my closest friends are now work in history of art or mathematicians and stuff, and it's amazing actually being able to take. I was able to take some of my closest friends to their first classical music concerts and stuff whilst at university. I mean, it's a very, very different experience to what you get at music college, and I think that's really what attracted me to the whole program.
So you were doing an awful lot of self-teaching, teaching by doing, which is what an awful lot of us do is set up your own ensemble in 2019. You set up your own ensemble in 2019 called Orchestra Rhea. And I read the first concerts of Brahms Requiem, so you started nice and easy. So you're sort of teaching yourself. And if you've been around youth orchestras and whatever, like the National Youth Orchestra, you're going to know what sort of works and what doesn't sort of work, and you're going to find out technically. You're going to find yourself quite quickly. I think that's a major thing. I think all of the conductors who've come on here have said be yourself. So if you're not going into a school of conducting with somebody who teaches you, for hours a week at piano classes and whatever else, you're just doing it yourself. Well, then that's it's a quick way of finding yourself and being yourself. I didn't really start conducting until I was 35 or 32, and there were bits of me from all of the people who were conducting me at the time. So, but I didn't have any lessons in all of that time. So
yeah, it's an interesting one.
And so how did you were you were you videoing yourself? What were you doing? What was your approach to during all of this time?
Well, to come back to your previous question, which I think is also relevant, I managed to find some people who I really trusted, some mentors that I really trusted, and that was kind of how I modeled my sort of what I needed, I think, to develop as a musician and as a conductor. So, you know, I think one of the most important mentors in my life still is Colin Metters. And I know he taught a lot of people who've actually appeared on this podcast as well.
Yes.
But he is a very important figure, musical figure in my life as a conductor. And I think, you know, when you can find people whom you trust, and who can direct you to, you know, your problem areas, for example, you know, that can be very helpful. As much as what we say is true, is that, you know, especially as instrumentalists, we kind of know what works, we know what doesn't work. As a conductor, you always need to have a kind of external third person gaze on you. And I think a mentor can be a very good person to do that, because we can't always assess what we're doing in the most unbiased unbiased way.
You're right there.
You know, and even watching. Absolutely, you know, and even watching videos of oneself is sometimes not as useful as having someone else watch the video and say, you know, because also I think a lot of us will say, oh gosh, well, you know, that looks terrible, I don't really know how to fix it. Or, you know, we might identify the wrong problem actually, and someone else can actually come in and just say, actually, what you're doing is you're bending your knees too much, and that means that your center of gravity isn't, you know, stabilized or whatnot. You know, you need someone who can just have that third person sort of gaze, and I think that's very important.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, I loathe watching videos of myself conduct.
It's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely awful.
Yeah.
But when I come to teach, I use video a lot with my pupils, and I love watching them. And it's a very easy way of highlighting problems, or also discovering problems. And yeah, I use it often with pupils, but with myself, my God, I hate it. I loathe it. And I think that's also partly because, you know, you remember performing, you remember being in the moment and just doing what you always do to get the results that you can get. And sometimes that can lead to bad habits, but I still got the results I wanted, you know. So you know what I mean? You're looking at it dispassionately much later and thinking, oh my God, technically that was awful. But actually, if you remember how the concert went, it went really, really well. So, you know, does it matter? Who knows? I mean, it's a really tricky one.
Who knows? But I think it's also very interesting speaking to instrumentalists or people who have performed extensively as instrumentalists before becoming conductors. And I think a lot of I don't know what your experience was, but certainly my experience was, you know, okay, this is how I feel on stage when I'm doing my concerto. How do I transfer that onto the podium as a conductor? And that is not often the most helpful thing to be doing, especially as, you know, with an instrument, you have this kind of immediate feedback, whereas with an orchestra, it's much more nebulous. The feedback can come to you in many different forms. It's not always immediate. And also, you know, you don't always understand the psychology of the moment with those musicians in particular. So if there's anything I could say to any instrumentalists, you know, serious instrumentalists who are thinking about going into conducting, is that it's not exactly the same thing. You can't just apply your set of, you know, your soloist set of skills to becoming a conductor.
No, absolutely you can't. And not only is it nebulous when you do it, it's nebulous every time you change orchestra. It's the nebulousness, if that's a word, gets even greater, because, you know, each orchestra reacts differently, has a different chemistry, feel, attitude. Yeah, it's much different. Whilst we're still basically in the world of violining, I have seen that you've appeared as soloist with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic and other places. I mean, you know, you're very young, possibly the youngest conductor I've interviewed for the podcast. What are your plans with violin and conducting going forwards? Are you still playing often? Though I did see your fingernails were a little bit longer, so maybe you've had some time off. What are your plans with the violin going forwards? Or has it, like me, gone into its case and only comes out for bowings and high days and holidays?
I think it's probably very similar to what you've just described. I think I really don't play the violin a lot. And it's not that I don't have an interest, it's just I mean, are there enough hours in the day? I don't think so.
No, I agree. I mean, conducting takes up everything, you know.
Absolutely, and I really admire people who can keep on playing. But as I said, you know, for me, the light bulb moment was conducting. It wasn't the violin, and I think I need to kind of. That's just how I feel, and that's how I've always felt, and I just, you know, that's just my way of honoring that. Just you know, by not playing as much, and as I, you know, you're right, I do bring it out, you know, for the occasional bowings and fingerings and stuff, but no, my focus is solely on learning scores right now. Isn't it all? Isn't that the way?
Absolutely. It's funny now that work is starting to very slowly starting to happen here in the UK. This is now June 2021, dear listener. That, you know, I'm even finding it difficult to edit next week's podcast episode because, you know, that can take anywhere between 2.5 hours to 2.5 days, depending on who it is and what we talked about. You know, and so that's sort of clashing with score study. So I need a good 3 weeks to get a few done. Before we totally leave the crossover between violin and conducting, as I said, you know, you were in the Young Musician of the Year twice as a string finalist, but you also won second prize in La Maestra last year in 2020. Are competitions something you're going to continue applying for as a conductor, or since getting the assistant conductor job at St. Louis Symphony Orchestra and other things we're going to talk about very soon, is that something that you think, right, I've done this now, I don't want to do any more? Or, you know, competitions and conducting is quite a tricky subject, you know. Personally, I'm very lucky in the fact that I was 35 when I started conducting, and as you'll know, that's too old to apply for competitions. So I could never do it, and I hold my hands up and say, well, you know. But for you, is it something you want to carry on doing?
No. It isn't.
Nice, easy, quick answer. But the reasoning.
Can I make that a bit vaguer for you? Yes, the reasoning behind it. I find it difficult to judge people on, not on first impression, but on a first kind of imprint. And I think that's what conducting competitions sometimes do. You know, you have to go in and try and reveal yourself, you know, in about 10 seconds, if not less. Obviously, that's a part of the job, and you know, everyone who knows anything about conducting will know that, you know, the orchestra basically judges you upon your entering the room. So, you know, it can be, it's a difficult one. But for me personally, I think I'm just happier working with people on a longer term basis, you know, a week, 2 weeks, and that's not what a competition will offer me. And that's just an important part, I think, of my development, is moving away from that and really getting stuck in with ensembles for as long a period as I can, and really sort of creating something that will have an end point, that is the music, really, that's not just, you know, someone winning first or second or third prize. I think for me, the Maestro competition was important because I wanted to be a part of the first edition of this, you know, what I think is a pioneering initiative. You know, at the same time, Claire Gibault, the conductor who started the competition, was very clear in saying that, you know, the only reason why we're having an all-female conducting competition is so that in a couple of years' time we don't need it anymore. And I just thought that was the most brilliant way of putting it, and something that a philosophy that I agree with very much. So that's why I did it. But no more competitions for me, I don't think.
Well, I'm going to pick your brains because of what you just said about the La Maestra competition. You know, you can read on, well, you know, there's a blog that we may or may not know, that very clickbaity headlines that you get to see now and again on the internet, saying only one female finalist out of 8 in whatever competition it might be, or no females have got to the final this time. What do you think about these headlines and this? You know, I look at it and go, well, let's go back and see how many people have applied. So if 25% of the people who applied were female, well, maybe 25% in the final would be a fair result, you know, 2 out of 8 or whatever. But if only 6% applied were female, and there are 2 in the final, well, actually, that's a really good result. It has you have to. So, how do you take these headlines? Do you have a feeling about them? Because some people get very, very irate about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a lot of feelings about this, and I think any quote unquote female conductor in a way should. I mean, it's a difficult one. I think for me, I really don't focus on my view is that I'm not focusing on the outcome, or how many women get into such and such competition, or how many women don't. I think for me, the most important thing is targeting the problem at its root cause. And its root cause is that sexism in the world is still rife. It is still a thing. I mean, I always say that, and I'm sure a lot of other conductors get this. They say, how does it feel being a female conductor? I think my answer is always, I feel more respected as a female conductor sometimes than I do as a quote unquote female. I think the world is still in a very tricky position in that sense. And I think for me, the only thing that I can really do is to encourage, especially at a young age, girls to take the same opportunities, or to be given the same opportunities as boys in schools, for girls to be treated the same way as boys from an early age. I think really targeting the problem at its root cause as a sociological byproduct of sexism is the most important thing we can do. So I don't really focus on the outcomes, or how many XYZ conductors we have in XYZ. I really try and just focus on making it better for the next generation, because I don't think we're going to fix problems after it's too late. We have to fix it, as I said, nip it in the bud. And I hope people can understand that view, because I think with a lot of classical musicians, or just classical music in general, sometimes there's this perception that we are perceived as being kind of on the fringes of society, whereas a lot of really deep sociological issues really do affect us. So we just need to be open to that.
That's very true.
Does that answer your question?
It does answer my question. And it reminds me of Natalie Stutzman's answer to what would you change about being a conductor, and she said losing the word female before the word conductor. She's just a conductor. She shouldn't have to always be referred to as a female conductor. And I think it's one of the best answers anybody's ever given to that question. And I think actually in some respects what's happening in the classical music world to do with conductors and composers, it is more ahead of other areas of society. It doesn't mean that it's right or it's in the right place, but it is more ahead and things are happening. So, I think you answered it very well, very well indeed. Before we go on to St. Louis, and also I want to talk to you very much about stepping in at the LSO and guesting and going back to what you were talking about, meeting an orchestra and how quickly people judge or view you. I've noticed that you've conducted both youth groups. You've conducted the Chineke Juniors Orchestra and also amateur groups, the London Lawyers Orchestra. I'm assuming that's an amateur group. It must be. Some conducting teachers or mentors would say to you, do it for a little while and then pack them in and don't do them, because your technique is different conducting both of those things. That is an argument. I would argue that there are certain youth orchestras and amateurs I would always want to conduct, and I still think I conduct them exactly the same way. Are you still planning on working in these areas? And have you had that said to you? Because I take issue with that. I know some other conductors would say, no, absolutely. Once you've got to working at a professional level, don't work with kids and amateurs.
Yeah, I mean, I take issue with that, absolutely. I think I've been lucky enough that no one has yet told me or advised me in this way. I mean, even I think education is a huge part of our lives. I mean, not only are we continuously educating ourselves, a part of being a conductor is sort of taking people with you. And I think that is a very powerful mechanism, and that should be utilized. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, especially when it comes to to working with youth orchestras, I mean, as I said, some of my most powerful experiences, you know, even life-changing experiences, have been as the member of a youth orchestra. So if I'm able to participate in that, you know, in an event like that for a young instrumentalist, then my goodness, I would absolutely love to. It's interesting you mentioned the lawyers. I remember when I first got that gig, one of my friends said, well, it's always very useful to know a room full of lawyers. So, you know, you have to be open-minded about these things. Not always about the music, no. But in St. Louis, I mean, a huge part of my job is working as the music director of the youth orchestra there. And I mean, that is also what attracted me to that position, because I mean, they're celebrating, I think, 100 years of family concerts this year. So I mean, it's a very community-centered organization, which I think I really appreciate. I think as musicians, there's always more that we can do to, you know, ingratiate ourselves into a community, into the community. I mean, we live such peripatetic lifestyles as conductors, just trotting around the globe, you know, going from orchestra to orchestra. Isn't it wonderful to be able to be involved with people for more than a week and you know, have a kind of arc of development rather than, you know, as I said, a quick few rehearsals and a concert. So for me, that's very important, and it's something that I really hope to be doing. You know, working with young people is a gift, and I think if we've been gifted now, we should definitely use it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think that passing on what we have, what we know to the next generation, enthusing them, you know, as you said, some of my greatest experiences music making were as a child or a young adult in a youth orchestra, and to help the next generation come through and appreciate music, whether they want to even be a musician or not, doesn't matter, appreciating it. And I think with the amateurs as well, if you've got a great group, and I have two groups I work with regularly, I'm loath to give in, to hear them reach professional standards, and there be a room full of, you know, in your case, lawyers. It can often, you know, my orchestra in Birmingham, I call the first violins the maths section because there are two maths professors, a physics professor. It's full of people with mathematical brains, you know. But to hear them produce something where they walk off and go back to their lives totally enriched, yeah, I think you'd be foolish not to take part in that. You've just mentioned it, St. Louis. You start soon, I would imagine. It says 21 to 22 when I look it up. You know, you just told me already you're going to be conducting the youth orchestra. What other roles do you have? Do you know how many concerts you're going to be given? How many weeks a year you have to be there, shadowing Stefan Denev, but also guest conductors. So what's the gig? What does it entail?
What's the gig? Well, I was actually supposed to start in September 2020. So this has been a long time coming. There was actually the last thing I did before the UK's first national lockdown in March. I remember I went out on March 13th or something, came back a few days later, and then, you know, didn't know whether I was going to see them again, pretty much. But I was able to go in March, April of this year, and that was really wonderful. Just being able to, you know, at least have contact with the youth orchestra, that's, you know, contact that's not purely over Zoom. And also just working with Stefan. I mean, I was very lucky because he then gave me 2 weeks to do my own programs and my own repertoire with you know, obviously a socially distanced symphony orchestra. So I have had sort of an initial contact with them. I think what I'm most excited about, apart from my role as the music director of the youth orchestra, is working with Stefan. And I mean, you know, this goes back to what we were saying earlier about, you know, our conversation about mentors and who to trust and who to listen to. And I think for me, Stefan is a brilliant music maker. He is a musician full of joy and passion. I think he also complements me very well. There are things that, you know, I think he does which, you know, I would like to learn from. I'd like to learn how he does them. I mean, it's very important, I think, to also surround yourself with people who are not, you know, cookie cutter versions of yourself. You know, people who are very different, who have different views about music, about the world. But I think we really do get on. I think I'm so grateful to be able to work with him. So I'll be shadowing him a lot, and then I get a few sort of run out concerts. In the US, they have these concerts whereby you go to sort of smaller satellite concert halls, and do sort of smaller programs of the subscription week concerts. And I also get the subscription week myself in April 2022.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah, brilliant. I've said it before. I think assistant jobs are, if you don't win a competition, I think they're the quickest and best way of just absorbing so much information, so much wisdom from not only the music director, but from guest conductors, principal guest conductors. Being in a TQ with an orchestra member of 30 years standing and just, chatting to them about why that particular note on the second bassoon is difficult to produce or whatever it is. Little things like that. They're a massive resource. And to all young conductors, don't be sniffy about them. I did my apprenticeship as a player, but then, if I was starting out now, I'd want to go and spend a year or 2 years, doing exactly what you're doing.
Absolutely. I think it's also very important as a young conductor to understand the way orchestras in different countries work. I mean, not only that, but purely, from a purely organizational point of view, how the mechanism of the institution of the orchestra works, and speaking to people on the administration team, on the artistic planning side, and all the CEOs and the fundraisers. I think if you want to eventually develop a very a fruitful relationship or a long-term relationship with an orchestra, you really have to be ready to deal with all these other things that come with, for example, being a music director, or just working with orchestras on a regular basis. You really do have to know, and those people are very important people in the musical world, and they do amazing things.
Yeah.
Really do.
Guesting, the hamster wheel of conducting, as I like to call it, because we love being on the wheel. Sometimes it's difficult to get off, but we love being on the wheel. You recently stepped in for an indisposed Susanna Malky at the LSO, which I would imagine that was at fairly short notice. And you're at that stage now where you'll be doing probably more guesting than non-guesting, if that makes sense as a sentence, for quite a while. How much are you looking forward to that? How much have you enjoyed what you've done, for instance, the week with the LSO? And as we were talking about earlier on, this nebulous nature, how are you with that? That there is a moment for non-conductors where you pick up your baton and you say to the orchestra, right, let's start the symphony. You do an upbeat and a downbeat, and you have absolutely no idea what's going to come at you. Sound, when it's going to happen, what the attack's going to be, how they're going to take your beat. The second time you go back to an orchestra, and therefore you've learned. But what's that like for you, and how much are you looking forward to and enjoyed what you've done already?
Interesting. I mean, I would, just to add to what you were saying, I would tentatively suggest that actually, even if you come back to an orchestra, you don't always know what to expect, or you shouldn't always think that you expect.
There's also the fact that you don't always come back to the same players. Orchestras are big enough for you to come back to a completely different wind and brass team, for instance, and maybe 5 of the 8 front string players around you are different as well. I mean, that happens. You're absolutely right.
It really does.
Yeah.
And I think that's why that kind of informs the way that I think about guesting, is that whether I return to an orchestra or not, every time I step onto the podium is a new kind of reset. Hello again, or hello, let's do this. I think for me, it's very important not to necessarily be lulled into a false sense of security. Not that what we do is dangerous, but that we shouldn't necessarily switch off any parts of our senses because we feel as though we're in a safe, sort of familiar space. I think that's also one of the most exciting things about it, is that you don't always know what you're going to get. I think in terms of guesting, I'm sure people have said this on this podcast before, but as a conductor, mentally you have to be very strong, and you have to have this kind of, I wouldn't say, it's not an arrogance, but it's a self-belief that what you are doing is the right way, and that you as a person can help people get onto that track. I think at the same time you have to then be, it's a symbiosis of things. I mean, it's a dynamic between you and the orchestra. You are utilizing their talents, sometimes absolutely fantastic. I mean, things that even as violinists, you and I could never do, like Don Juan all the time, Heldenleben all the time. I mean, just these relentless, I mean, you did it because you were a violinist, but I guess I'm speaking for myself. They're performing incredible feats, and I think you have to be respectful of that and know how to channel their energies into, fundamentally the interpretation that you want. At the same time, I think you have to be flexible enough not only to accept what they're presenting you with, but especially as a young conductor, knowing that they would have done Beethoven 5 200 more times
yes.
Than you, and they would have done that Mahler symphony on tour with, I don't know, Bitchkov or someone like that. So it is very humbling, but at the same time, I think once you get past that insecurity or that sense that you're in front of a group of players that knows more about the physical aspect of playing this piece than you might, then actually that's when the real music making starts. And that's a big step, I think, for young conductors especially.
I think it's a very head screwed on correctly attitude to have. The only thing I would say is that from my years of sitting in the orchestra is that there is a very, very fine line between somebody who can inspire you through being very confident and knowing exactly what they want, to just tipping over the other side to it being arrogance. And I think orchestras crave the one side of the line and they loathe the other side of the line. And I think, all of us at times have drifted on the wrong side of the line, possibly. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you go in there and you know what you want, but be willing to sort of accept also the hundreds of years of experience coming from the orchestra back to you, then you're absolutely in the right place. And to go in and reset every time is a good thing. I mean, even with orchestras I go to regularly, I walk in, I say hello, and I say hello to the same people. Some of the people, I'm working with the CBSO next week. Some of them I've known for 30 years. But then you stand up and go, right, this week we're doing this, and now we restart and we reset, and we've not done this before, and it's absolutely the right attitude to have. So good on you. That's a brilliant attitude to have. Guest conducting is a big part of a conductor's life, and you may want to know more about it. From how the programme is chosen, all the way through to the rehearsals, concerts, and even how we spend our free time. I've started a diary over on my Patreon page, which lets you see how a guest conducting engagement works from every angle, and my day-to-day thoughts about my experiences. The first week is already uploaded and available to you now. You can read this diary, plus all upcoming diaries, articles, essays, bonus mini-episodes, interviews, and much more when you subscribe from just £5 a month. If you pay annually, you also receive a 10% discount when you subscribe to this ever-growing resource about conductors, conducting, and what we do. Details are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, back to my chat with Stephanie Childress. One last question, which you'll know that you're going to get asked before the 10 questions, which is score prep. We've already discovered that your pianism skills are not quite what you wish they were. So when you come to learn a new score, I'm imagining you sit down at your desk. Do you start at bar 1, go to the end? Do you listen to recordings? Or do you an overall approach and then go at 0 in on the details? And the important one for us geeks, are you a scribbler in of things? Are you a writer of notes? Are you a red, blue, black colours, highlighter pens? Or are you just completely and utterly blank score? What's your process?
Gosh, that's a lot to cover. What I will say is that I do go sort of from the macro to the micro. So I'm looking at particularly structures, then phrase structures if it's sort of classical, romantic, even going into sort of mid-20th century things, if I can get away with it. I also try to get away with that notion, especially in classical. In classical period music, I try to get away from the idea of bar lines in themselves. So sometimes the phrase structure things can be a bit too pedantic, but I try and do that just so that I can learn it. But I mean, I have a very kind of, I wouldn't even say sensory, but I mean, I really love watching a work in a concert hall. I think for me that's one of the most important things, because you can see the players really reacting to what they're doing and to the person in front of them as well, but really reacting to the music and how they move with it, and I think maybe that's the player side of me coming out. But actually when I'm thinking of the piece that I'm conducting, I really try and visualize the people in front of me and how they move, and how, even from a practical perspective, that down bow is going to work or that up bow is going to work. I really try and visualize it. I think I'm not very, hardcore when it comes to, listening to recordings or not listening to recordings. I think sometimes, especially if you're very busy, if you're traveling a lot, if you don't have a lot of sort of time to yourself, just getting the music to become a bit of an earworm via recording can sometimes work. It's work. I mean, this is, my personal experience. I think it's worked for me, and from then I can extrapolate, my own interpretation of what I want. And sometimes it'll be completely different to the recording that I've been listening to. It's not as though that recording becomes sort of my imprint or my it doesn't become the thing that my interpretation resembles the most. In terms of colors, I must say I can be a bit of a Puritan. I do like just using pencils, but I've been doing a lot of opera recently, and I've learned that sometimes you just don't know who's singing, and you just need a little coloring here and there. It does help quite a bit, especially when it comes to opera. Also, when you're in the pit, I mean, obviously you should know the score by heart, whatever, but when you're in the pit, it's so dark that a tiny sort of flash of color can sometimes just sort of put you at ease. So I'm very open to that. It's a new dimension, and I'll tell you all about it when that's been fully fledged in my brain, but that's still a very new discovery.
Well, I'm definitely not puritanical about listening to recordings. I mean, I've seen great conductors on various films say you'd be an idiot not to listen to what other great conductors do with music. You'd be an idiot not to listen to what a composer does if he conducts his own piece. And we're living in this world now where everything is available. When I grew up, and if I wanted to listen to a piece of music, I had to go to my local library and borrow the LP. Now I can literally sit at home and on my phone listen to anything, and I think you'd be crazy not to. But then what you just said is that not one recording is your imprint. If you're doing Beethoven 7, you're not there to reproduce Carlos Kleiber's recording with the Vienna Philharmonic. There may be things about it that you love, but not everything. And you listen to whatever. I mean, actually, I'm doing Malcolm Arnold's Symphony No.5 next week, and I realized last night it had been years since I listened to him conducting it with the CBSO, so I put it on, and there were things on there I thought, I'd forgotten about that. Whether it's going to change what I do next week is neither here nor there, but it's informed me, and that, I think you'd be stupid not to be informed. So there we are.
Absolutely, I completely agree.
Stephanie, it's that time which cannot be avoided. It's the 10 questions. And you will know that I start with, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
The sound or noise that I love above all others is the sound of Will Self's voice. I think if people don't know who Will Self is, there are some brilliant podcasts of his floating around, and also listening to him narrate his own works is also a real experience. Amazing voice. It
is definitely a voice that can only be. It is, it's an amazing voice. I'm interested now to know if there's somebody's voice is the sound that you hate.
We won't go there. But I think, interestingly about Will Self is that it's not only his voices, but it's really what he says as well. I mean, it's that perfect combination where you get form and content. Yeah. And it's my favorite thing.
And the sound that you hate?
I really don't like it when especially young children and young infants scream, and it's not the noise of the actual scream that really bothers me. Just I feel as though they're in pain or there's something wrong, and it's sort of like this sort of alert which kind of makes me feel a bit queasy and sorry for them.
Yeah, there's an emotion behind a specific child's noise. Having had 2 daughters, still got 2 daughters. There there's a lot of noise with young children, let's face it, as parents, but there is a specific scream that you think, no, that's really painful. That's, that really means something. And yeah, I agree with you. And you can almost block out other people's other kids' noises, but then there is a certain scream where it makes every human being on the planet turn their head to find out what's gone on. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah,
that's the one.
If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
Well, I would love to have 24 hours free in London, because I think it's I'm very biased. I was born here, and I still think it's one of the most amazing cities in the world. I would do quite a lot. I would start off with a good brunch somewhere, wander around the West End, maybe even pop over the river to the Globe to watch a production, see what's going on, or the National Theatre. That's one thing about lockdown that I've really missed is live theatre, alongside live concerts. Maybe go to the cinema is another thing that I'm just basically telling you what I want to do when after lockdown finishes. After the pandemic's over. No, go to the cinema, maybe catch a French film, and then end up in a jazz club somewhere.
Who would be a favourite conductor or conductors of yesteryear?
Well, he's still with us, but no longer conducting, is Bernard Haitink, who I think is still a great source of inspiration, both as a person, the way he conducts himself on the podium, and as a musician. I think there's been a particular resurgence of Carlos Kleiber fans amongst my colleagues and people of my age. I think I'd also have to go with Carlos Kleiber. It's amazing. I talk to people who have worked with him and who have seen him, perform and stuff. And it's just, they all said that his presence and his magnetism was truly a sort of once in a generation thing. So I would have loved to have been there, but we have some wonderful recordings and some wonderful videos as well.
Well, two names that appear regularly in the answer to that question, Kleiber more than anybody else, I would say. And I think not just young, but all of the conductors have said how much he was an inspiration, be it rehearsals or just even aesthetically, the way his beat. The somewhat harder question, possibly, though I don't think it will be for you. Can you name some favourite current conductors?
Some favourite current conductors. Well, for me, it's I've been lucky to assist and to sort of be mentored by some really fantastic people. I think Stefan is high on my list right now, and I was lucky enough to work with Sir Simon Rattle as well, and that was truly an amazing experience. Just watching the sort of focus that he brings into a rehearsal room is something that I've not seen. I don't see very often. I think another person that I would definitely have to put on this list is Vladimir Yurovsky, and I've always admired the work that he did with the LPO, and I was lucky enough to assist him recently as well. He is just a fountain of information and of knowledge, and he is so passionate about really understanding the context in which pieces were written or performed or whatnot. I think he's a historian as well as a musician. It's really truly amazing. I really appreciate that.
Well, going to one of those, let me put it this way, dear listener. One of those conductors, I'm not sure I've asked yet. One of them I've definitely asked and he said no, and one of them has not said no yet. And to put you out of your misery, the one who's not said no yet is Sir Simon Rattle, and I'm hoping to get for episode 100. I wonder, when he mentors you and when he talks to you, is he really going in on specifics? Or I took up conducting after he'd left Birmingham, so I never had the chance. I asked him one question once about batons, and he was very helpful. But what's he like as a sort of mentor teacher?
Brilliant. I don't know if I'm allowed to say he's a mentor teacher. I've worked with him a few times, but it's really wonderful to have someone who kind of, it's never really a specific question, nor is it a specific answer, but he has a way of thinking about music, which is very practical, which I think is very helpful as a conductor, but he translates that into a very kind of holistic sense. I mean, I don't know if I'm making any sense. It's something that is very, very enigmatic and that you can't quite put your finger on. But I think for me, he encapsulates what the kind of knowledge and the kind of way of the methods as well that that one needs to be a conductor. So I think that's something that I've tried to learn from him.
In short, having sat through hours, literally hundreds of hours of rehearsal under Simon, there are many times now as a conductor, I think to myself, what would Simon be doing here? Or what would Simon say here? And that's, 20 odd years later. So yeah, it's absolutely,
and you're quite right. I mean, he also gives great advice. So that's,
yeah, absolutely.
Really, I've gone to him with a lot of conundrums, and he's always sort of managed to pick the right answer. Yeah. So it's wonderful.
What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
I conducted Brahms 2 when I was too young. And
I'm laughing out loud. I'll tell you why in a minute, but go on.
And we all make mistakes. We're only human. But that was sort of my big mistake. Thankfully, it was I was very young as a student orchestra, a very, very small thing. But yeah, that was traumatizing because it's a difficult piece, and Brahms is a difficult composer. I think the older I get, the more I realize that. I think. I still think his music is absolutely fantastic, but I'll definitely be putting Brahms to one side for the next couple of years. But an amazing work. There are loads of scary pieces that I'd happily do, but Brahms 2 is not one of those right now.
Well, I wonder, it's probably for completely different reasons, but the reason why I was laughing and chuckling out loud was when I first started conducting, I was lucky enough to be asked to conduct a local amateur orchestra in Birmingham, which I still conduct. And the minute they asked me to put together 3 programs for the first year I was going to do it, I immediately put Brahms 2 on that list. I didn't conduct it again for 16 or 17 years, and it was again with the same orchestra. I just wouldn't do it again. I think that was partly because, and it's funny, going back 2 questions, it's partly because I was totally in love with Carlos Kleiber's performance with the Vienna Phil, which goes all the way back to listening to recordings and not trying to reproduce anything. Whether I was trying to reproduce it or not, I don't know. But I had a similar experience with the Eroica, with the same orchestra in the same season. I immediately wanted to do it again. I immediately wanted to work out what I'd done wrong and why I'd find it so difficult. And by getting back on the horse or on the bike, I sorted it out. But I had no interest in doing that with Brahms 2 at all. I was just happy to listen to it. I'd go and cut to concerts and watch it. I didn't want to conduct it again. Now I think I've worked it out. But it took 17 years of, putting it literally on the back burner, or even on ice, and just, I'm not touching that until I'm older, better, wiser, and then it'll be fine. So absolutely. That's why I was laughing. Yeah.
Well, no, it's the appropriate reaction. I think, especially as Carlos Kleiber, as wonderful as he is, he sort of, that piece is just so tied up with him as a person, him as a musician. I think he, in a way, it makes our job even more difficult when we approach Brahms 2. But I mean, what a wonderful challenge to have.
When traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
I find it physically difficult to leave the house without a book, and it can't exactly be any book. I really love fiction, I must say, and it's something that I, especially growing up and going to school in France. I mean, we were really encouraged to read a lot. So I would, if I could, I'd take a nice Zola, or maybe I'm getting into some Flaubert as well. So just maybe like a really big sort of French book would be absolutely perfect. I think there's some wonderful stuff out there.
And very necessary on those weeks guesting, as we were talking about earlier on, when you are alone, and dinner for one and a book can be quite a nice time, rather than dinner for one and staring at all of the other people eating, which is very, very miserable.
I know. Well, I'm an only child, so I feel as though the lifestyle sort of kind of suits me very well. I'm very happy to just sit down, on a park bench and with a book and, stew in my own thoughts.
Yeah. Number 8. What's the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Only one?
You can change more than one if they're good things. Change as much as you like. I mean, go for it.
I mean, I would love to. I mean, I strive to do this in my own life, but I would love to feel as though conductors could be more involved in the political sphere. I'm not talking about necessarily politics per se, but just be more involved in helping musicians, or being on the musicians union and really understanding sort of how those things work, and how, as people with a certain degree of leadership capabilities, we can actually utilize those skills to help the very people with whom we're working. I think it's what I see, especially in the UK, happening is, we're suffering some tremendous cuts to the arts, and I think we need people who can really stand up and try and make a difference. And I hope to see more of that. I think especially with the younger generation, I think and especially since COVID, I think a lot of people have had a sort of an awakening of sorts, whereby we do feel as though we have a voice, and we can, as artists, we can actually really generate effective change. So that'd be quite nice. I think people still tiptoe around it nowadays, and conductors do, and rightly so, because it's like walking on eggshells. It can be very tricky, but I think for me, that's something that I'd love to see, and I'd love to feel as though I could be encouraged into things like that.
Well, I think, over history, or over at least the 30 odd years I've been involved in classical music professionally in this country, there are some people who stick out as wanting to be involved in everything from grassroots music making up through salaries and to, funding of orchestras across the country. People like Simon Rattle, for instance, obviously are people that stand out. I think there are other conductors who really haven't done that because they're from other countries that maybe you don't need to do that because of the cultural attitude towards music in their own country, and they've not been brought up thinking that they need to fight for their corner. But yeah, I think more people, it's a big subject. I think, a lot of it's got to do with how invested in the orchestra the music director or the conductor is, whether they even live there. I think that often can be a big thing. I think if you live in Birmingham, you get a feeling for what Birmingham was about, and then maybe you've got more chance or willingness or want to fight their corner for them. And the same is in Manchester, and especially in somewhere like Liverpool, which has got such a character of its own. But again, doesn't mean that all conductors want to do it, but I think more should. And maybe a return to the older days where a conductor lives where the job is. And I know Bram Tovey said, he's turned down jobs elsewhere because he doesn't want to move from where he is. He can't sort of flying in and flying out. You don't feel that you can invest in the community. And I think that's the important thing, isn't it? That's what you're talking about, is being investing in the community, not only the community of players working in the orchestra, but who they're serving around them, the city, the town, whatever it is, and having, vested interest in it all.
Absolutely. And I think, due to the climate emergency, I know a lot of agencies are trying to, reduce their air travel and things like that. I mean, I think the climate emergency is going to push a lot of people like us into not difficult positions, but into new scenarios, whereby, you can't always, hop across the Atlantic and do things, or you can't justify, always hopping up across the Atlantic and things like that. So it's a big question, but I think, as long as we start really asking ourselves these questions and discussing it amongst ourselves and with, instrumentalists and managers and stuff, I think we can generate some substantial change. And I think it needs it. As I said, our organizations in the UK are continuously having their funding cut, and something needs to be done. Otherwise, it'll be a very difficult. It'll be very difficult for the next generation. I really do believe that.
So do I. Here. I completely agree with you. Spent far too long on Twitter saying all of that sort of stuff, and will continue to do so.
Absolutely. I'll join you in the cause.
Yeah. Number 9. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I really like languages, and I like learning languages. I think for me, I feel that if I were ever to have a midlife crisis, my 40s, 50s, I would just sort of go to a mountainous area of France or somewhere and shut myself in a shed and translate. Particularly, there's a lot of sort of surrealist text by, verse text by French surrealist writers who I'd be reading these things like Louis Aragon and trying to get translations to my English friends saying, my God, this is such great stuff. Like, I really want you to read it, and not being able to find any translation. So I ended up translating a large part of some of his works just so I could give it to my friends. So I think that, when the midlife crisis hits, that'll be where I am. And that's sort of my, in my alternate reality, I'd love to have been a translator.
Yeah, I'm very envious of people who speak more than one language. I struggle with the one I've actually, the one I use in this country. I can basically rehearse in German. I can very basically rehearse in Spanish. But yeah, I do wish I'd spent more time listening in my German lessons and listening in my French lessons at school. And it's got to the stage now where every time I learn a new word, it seems to take longer and longer to stick in the brain.
What happens is you learn a new word. This is what happens with me. I learn a new word, and then a word that I already know in a different language will just pop out. It's kind of like a one in, one out policy. It's very, very upsetting.
Linguistic Jenga, that's what it is.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, until eventually all of the blocks will fall to the floor. Finally, my favourite question of them all. If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
I think the important thing is that it would be a big meal. Lots of things to fit in there. So I would definitely have a roast chicken. I think for me, roast chicken, potatoes, and an assortment of vegetables is kind of one of those dishes that sticks out to me as a childhood dish, and a dish that I keep enjoying now, and I hope to keep enjoying. I think after the roast chicken, we would definitely have to go to a Chinese restaurant. I think, for me, Chinese food, especially coming from, Sichuan and Shanghai, those types of cuisines are just, for me, absolutely gobsmacking. So if I could have a sort of proper roast and then follow that up with a trip to one of my favorite Chinese restaurants, I would be very happy, and I would probably succumb, not from whatever ailment would get me, but yes, I'd definitely succumb by the amount of food eaten, but I'd be quite happy with that. That's all right.
And what would we be washing it down with?
We'd be washing it down with gin and tonics first. I've never been a huge cocktail person, although I've met a lot of conductors. I don't know if this has happened on this podcast, but I've met a lot of conductors who like to think that they're really into cocktails. So maybe that's the reason. That's like my Pavlovian response to avoid cocktails. So I would just have a gin and tonic, and a lovely Burgundy wine would be lovely. And maybe if I had to have a white wine, just a nice Chablis beforehand.
Well, it all sounds good to me. Twice I've given the answers for my final meal, an Argentinian steak in Argentina. But both times I've come very close to saying Chinese food, because I love Chinese food. And so, yeah, I'll happily, sounds very good to me. And yeah, overeating and being far too debauched sounds like a wonderful way to finish. And this is to finish now. It's been wonderful to chat to you. And I hope very soon that our paths cross and bump into you, and we can maybe share a gin and tonic or a conductor's cocktail, whatever that might be.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
A Mic on the Podium is devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat to a British conductor who, after studying French and UK law, went on to study piano and conducting in Vienna and then entered the German Kapellmeister system, eventually becoming general music director in Braunschweig. His career since has been highly successful in both the opera house and the concert hall. But until then, bye-bye.